Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to go ahead and combine my tight end and quarterback rankings video for week 2 of the 2022 fantasy football season into one singular episode before Thursday night football. Of course, like we typically do, we'll start out by talking about matchups at the positions, giving you guys some insight and perspective as to which defenses last week gave up the most points to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format and quarterbacks in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Now, after we talk about matchups, we'll then transition to our top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings, giving you guys some insight, some stats that justify the reasons as to how I think the position is going to stack up and why I have the rankings as such. Before we begin today's video and get into all of these different players and the stats that we're going to mention, I want to remind you guys, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season, for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So if you like today's content and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below. Greatly appreciate that. And for those of you who are regretting not playing in more fantasy leagues this season, I want to remind you, Underdog Fantasy is another way to play fantasy football and get yourself your fix. Again, whether it's the pick'ems game, picking higher or lower on a given player statistic. Again, for Thursday night football tonight, there's 2 teams and it's going to be relatively higher scoring. So maybe those higher numbers are looking quite juicy tonight. You can go ahead, travel to Underdog Fantasy, perhaps even draft some teams for tonight's contest. If you're interested, click on the link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew. When you sign up and make a first-time deposit using the code Andrew, you'll get a first-time deposit match up to $100. You can put your fantasy skills to the test, win some money, and have some fun playing fantasy football the Underdog way. Check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into our week 2 tight end rankings, but beginning with matchups. As you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses gave up to opposing quarterbacks last week in a half PPR scoring format. Again, why we talk about half PPR is meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard or full PPR league. So as of this current moment in time, last week the Arizona Cardinals got torched by Travis Kelce, who is going to be this week's #1 tight end, but as you continue to progress down the list, we find that, yes, there isn't enough information to give us a defined understanding as to how these defenses play against tight ends because, yes, when you play against Travis Kelce, you're going to get a lot of points dropped on your head. Doesn't mean that the Arizona Cardinals are bad against all tight ends, but in this current circumstance, they look like they're the worst team against the tight end position. Now, of course, some of the statistics that are on screen can give us some insight as to how we can approach a matchup and go ahead and potentially start a player because of said matchup. But ultimately, we're going to need a couple weeks here in order to get a pure defined idea as to how these teams play against tight ends and how many points they allow on a weekly basis on average. All right, I'll go ahead and refer to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video. As I typically do, we show the matchup on screen, and I also give you guys a star designation 1 through 5 as to how difficult I believe the matchup is for the current tight end. So let's go ahead and begin with our #1. We have Travis Kelce here for the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays later tonight. So for those of you who have Travis Kelce, you're obviously starting him. A couple things I wanted to mention just before we move on. Besides the fact that he had 8 catches, 120 yards, and a touchdown last week, looked incredible. He plays against the Los Angeles Chargers. In division matchup, he's always found success against them. In fact, in the last 3 games that he's played against the Los Angeles Chargers since 2020, he has averaged 23.17 fantasy points per game. Now, in those last 3 contests, he has had a minimum of 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 90 receiving yards in each of those games. He has scored 3 touchdowns in the last 3 games against his defense and is, of course, going to continue to find success. Darren Waller should have been able to score against this defense if it wasn't for Derek Carr throwing the ball behind him. I think Travis Kelce scores tonight, has himself another big performance against the Los Angeles Chargers. Moving on, let's talk about Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews was a little bit underwhelming last week against the New York Jets, but that all being mentioned, we're just going to continue to hope that Mark Andrews has an elevated ceiling of targets going in his direction, considering there is no Marquise Hollywood-Brown in this offense any longer. And the fact that Lamar Jackson didn't even run the ball that much last week is quite surprising that we didn't see Mark Andrews with even more targets. Nonetheless, 5 catches on 7 targets, 52 yards. This upcoming week, he takes on the Miami Dolphins. Last year, they played against the Miami Dolphins, and he found a lot of success. 15.3 fantasy points in that contest, in which he had 6 catches on 8 targets, 63 receiving yards, and of course, a receiving touchdown. Ultimately, Mark Andrews is one of the best tight ends in the league, so regardless of the matchup, we're still playing him, but this is an exciting one. He should be able to score some good points and get back on track this week. Moving on to Darren Waller. Now, luckily for Darren Waller, we saw Travis Kelce tear apart this defense, 8 catches, 121, like I mentioned just moments ago, but now this gives us a little bit more confidence that Darren Waller can find immediate success against this defense. He played 85% of the snaps last week, had himself 9.5 fantasy points. If it wasn't for Derek Carr completely selling the bag, listen, Darren Waller on the 5-yard line runs a drag route, has 3 steps on the guy that's covering him, and then all of a sudden you see Derek Carr throw the ball 3 yards behind Darren Waller incompleted pass, and that's all she wrote. Very easily could have had a 15-point fantasy week last week against the Los Angeles Chargers. Hopefully, we're going to see something like that this week against the Arizona Cardinals. A great matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Kyle Pitts. Listen, Kyle Pitts is worrisome. He may be a buy low candidate after this week. For those of you who drafted him, maybe that wasn't the greatest idea considering the strength of schedule that he began with. Hopefully he's going to find success this week, but it's going to be tough to find success against the Los Angeles Rams. They have typically been stout against opposing tight ends and do a pretty good job covering them. Nonetheless, the reason why I wanted to mention Kyle Pitts at this number 4 spot is because we have to play him. We've already made the investment. You got to play your studs and just hope for the best. But the stat that I went and found in a half PPR scoring format was that Kyle Pitts in the last 2 years has only had 3 games of over 10 fantasy points. That is something that is obviously concerning to us. Now, another one of these stats that I wanted to mention specifically as to why this is a difficult matchup. The Rams gave up 7.5 or more points to opposing tight ends 10 times last year. They gave up 10 or more fantasy points only 5 times last year. It's definitely possible, but 4 out of those 5 10-point performances accompanied a touchdown. Unless Kyle Pitts is finding the end zone, it's going to be tough for him to pass 10 points this upcoming week. Moving on to Dalton Schultz in a great matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, in the last 10 games that the Cincinnati Bengals have played, even including the NFL playoffs, in the last 10 games, 7 of those contests have led to a single receiving tight end eclipsing over 50 receiving yards. When you're getting that much success against this defense, of course, we're expecting Dalton Schultz to play well, whether or not Dak Prescott is active. Of course, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 7 catches on 9 targets, 62 yards, a great overall performance, playing 100% of the offensive snaps. He's not coming off the field. He's got a great matchup, and Cooper Rush is going to need a security blanket to get the ball to on a downly basis. That's going to be Dalton Schultz. Moving on, let's talk about Zach Ertz taking on the Raiders. Even though Zach Ertz was injured, he still found the end zone twice. Once was a touchdown, once was a 2-point conversion. Now, going into this upcoming week, hopefully he's going to be healthy and at a far better position than he was last week, but we expect him to continuously be on the field and find success. The tight end room from the Los Angeles Chargers combined for 6 catches and 78 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. If in fact Zach Ertz is at a full capacity, he is certainly going to be utilized. They need other receiving threats. Marquise Hollywood-Brown was not involved enough. Zach Ertz is going to have to step up and make some plays this upcoming week. Let's move on to TJ Hockenson taking on the Washington Commanders. Listen, the only thing that worries me about TJ Hockenson is that he only ran 30 routes on the 63 players that he was in. Now, of course, this is a run-first football team, but even with that being said, I'm expecting TJ Hockenson to be more of a receiving threat than some of the other options in this offense. Outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, DJ Chark, TJ Hockenson should be running routes every single down. They got to put somebody else in there blocking so that we can see this guy getting more opportunities. 7 targets is great, but unless you're getting to that 8-9 range, TJ Hockenson without a touchdown is going to be a tough trust on a weekly basis, especially in a half PPR standard scoring format. Again, as of right now, only running routes on 50% of your overall plays is tough, similar to a George Kittle of the past. But as of right now, we're going to go ahead, still start TJ Hockenson. Should be a decent matchup as of right now. Moving on to Dallas Goedert taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Listen, Dallas Goedert at this current moment is the number 2 receiving option for the Philadelphia Eagles. Considering he only had 3 catches on 4 total targets, it's not great, but we have to take into account that Zach Pascal only had 1 reception, Devonta Smith had 0 receptions, and A.J. Brown did the rest. As long as Jalen Hurts looks towards Dallas Goedert as his number 2 and will continue to funnel the ball in his direction, of course, success is going to be found. Touchdowns are going to be there down in the red zone, assuming Jalen Hurts isn't just running the ball in every opportunity he gets, which of course, he ran the ball 17 times last week. We're going to see a lot less of that this week, which should end up turning into more passing attempts. Moving on to Pat Freiermuth. This is the first 1-star matchup I have ever given thus far this season. Now, the reason is because the tight end position is playing against Bill Belichick's New England Patriots defense. The New England Patriots have been incredible against opposing tight ends over the last 5 years, I would say. As long as I've been doing this, they've always been good in terms of stopping tight ends. But Pat Freiermuth is coming off of a 10-point fantasy week in which he had 10 targets, 5 catches, 75 receiving yards. Very easily could have had over 120 receiving yards in that game if a couple of the passes were just a little bit more accurate from Mitchell Trubisky. That all being mentioned. But when I went ahead and looked into the New England Patriots and how much success tight ends found against them, in the last 20 games that they played, okay, including the NFL playoffs last year and their regular season, which also includes Week 1's contest against the Miami Dolphins of this year, only 3 out of the 20 tight ends that performed against them have put up 10 or more fantasy points. Unless a touchdown is going to be accompanied with his performance, it's going to be very difficult to trust in Pat Freiermuth. Even with that said, there's not too many options at the tight end position available for you to find success, so we may have to just roll with them going into this week. Moving on to Tyler Higbee, our number 10, playing against the Atlanta Falcons. He came off of a week in which he had 11 total targets. That is no joke of a number. If he's going to continue to see a high volume of targets while Van Jefferson's gone, while this running game isn't as effective as it was in seasons past, we may be in a conversation in which Tyler Higbee is going to be the number 2. And yes, he's going to be contesting against Allen Robinson in the amount of targets he potentially gets, but if Tyler Higbee, is going to stay on the field, playing 63 of the total 67 snaps, 94% of the time on the field, why not go ahead, get him into the mix even more often? It was a tough matchup last week against Buffalo. That's why I didn't have him ranked. Yet he still had a great volume of targets, which will continue to give me more confidence that maybe Matthew Stafford is going to look in his direction more often in the future. Moving on, let's talk about Gerald Everett. Yes, Gerald Everett had a touchdown in week 1, a great performance against the Las Vegas Raiders, but now he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. We're purely hoping that the absence of Keenan Allen is going to elevate the utilization of the tight end position within the Chargers offense. And if that's going to be the case, with Donald Parham out once again, Gerald Everett should be far more utilized down in the red zone, but if he's able to get more targets, even though he is splitting snaps and touches overall with the backup tight end on this team, I still think he's a pretty decent option for this week and tonight. Moving on to Dawson Knox. Listen, Knox is certainly someone that we are struggling to play this upcoming week, considering it's a Tennessee Titans matchup. They have been fantastic. We got to remember, Vrabel is from the tree of Bill Belichick, a former player of the New England Patriots, so he likes to lock down his tight ends himself. Over the last couple years, they've been fantastic. They didn't give up much last week, only gave up 1 catch, 1 reception, 1 receiving touchdown to a backup tight end. No big deal. But Dawson Knox is purely 100% reliant on touchdowns. If he doesn't end up in the end zone, we're expecting a performance that we're not going to want to see. Last season, when he didn't score a touchdown in a singular game, he was only averaging 4.59 fantasy points per game. Ultimately, that is not high enough of a number to justify him as a start option. But to be honest, considering the tight end position is so thin, we're going to have to look in his direction this upcoming week. Moving on, let's talk about Albert Okwuegbunam. Now listen, he had a pretty decent game in terms of overall opportunity, but we have to remember, they utilized 4 different tight ends in that offense. If you're going to target 4 different tight ends, the opportunity for Albert Okwuegbunam to get more and more, red zone looks, more looks, between the 20s, it's going to continue to diminish. 5 catches, 33 yards is fantastic, but in a half PPR scoring format, it's not enough to get the job done. We're hoping that the Texans matchup will elevate his overall potential, but only time will tell considering their current tight end usage. Moving on to Robert Tonyan, playing against the Chicago Bears. Listen, Robert Tonyan was fantastic in 2020, and I know that was a couple years ago, but you got to remember, when Aaron Rodgers needed a red zone threat, that's the direction that he looked towards. He was able to get Robert Tonyan 11 touchdowns in that 2020 season, and that's what we're looking towards. We're hoping that we're going to have a situation here where Robert Tonyan can get back into the mix and be a vital option down in the red zone, considering there is no longer a Devontae Adams. And sure, they want to run the ball, but they're going to have to pass eventually. And if Allen Lazard is going to continue to miss time, Robert Tonyan against the Chicago Bears is a decent matchup in my eyes and potentially a play picked up off the waivers. Moving on to Logan Thomas, another one of these players that I mentioned on my weekly waiver wire episode. We're going ahead and playing him against the Detroit Lions. I think this is an advantageous matchup. We saw Dallas Goedert, again, with the little utilization that he was given, still find success, 7.5 fantasy points. But we got to remember, similar to a Robert Tonyan, Logan Thomas in the past has been a good tight end. If you go ahead and give him opportunity, he will find success. And Carson Wentz, throughout his entire career, whether it was with Indianapolis or with Philadelphia, has always liked to target his tight ends. Of course, we're going to see Logan Thomas on the field. In 2020, the last time he was fully healthy for a full season, he was the number 7 overall tight end in fantasy football. If they continue to look in his direction, I think this is a fantastic matchup. While the defense is worrying about Terry McLaurin, worried about Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson, Antonio Gibson, maybe, just maybe, Logan Thomas sneaks past the defenders and finds himself in the end zone. Moving on to the final tight end option I wanted to mention on today's episode. Again, we could put many tight ends in this position. For those of you who are feeling comfortable running with Taysom Hill this week, maybe OJ Howard, maybe another option, by all means go for it. But listen, I do not want to give up on David Njoku. 1 week is 1 week. And going up against the New York Jets this upcoming week, I think there's definitely going to be an opportunity for him to resettle and find himself the start of his 2022 season. Now, last week we saw Harrison Bryant get a little bit more targets, yet in terms of tight end snap splits, they ran a lot of 2 tight end sets. That is a given. And that is certainly going to kind of diminish the overall opportunity of David Njoku being the premier tight end option in this offense. But over time, they're going to eventually get him involved. I'm thinking this is going to be the week against the New York Jets. It's an advantageous opportunity in this matchup. I'm rolling him out there if I have a chance and there's no better options available to me. All right, now that we've covered the tight end position, let's go ahead and let's show you guys the top 12 tight ends for this week. Again, I can only fit 12 on a page, but just giving you some perspective as to who I like and how I have it all stacked up at the end of week 2. Now that we've gone ahead and covered this, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below, subscribe if you have not yet already, and of course, Sunday morning, we will be live streaming here on the channel, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirkoff. We'll have updated rankings at every single primary position ready to go to help you out before kickoff, setting your lineups, answering questions. That's what we'll be doing, so be sure to join us on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you very much. All right, so now that we're past the tight end position, let's talk about quarterbacks, and let's talk about matchups going into week 2. Now, what I've gone ahead and demonstrated on the right side of the screen is how many points defenses gave up to opposing quarterbacks last week via passing stats alone. Now, again, we have to talk about the rushing upside of a quarterback, certainly, but over the last couple years, I've collected data regarding, rushing quarterbacks and the potential matchups that they face every single week. And ultimately, as long as a quarterback is willing to run the ball, they're going to find success regardless of matchup. They're going to continue to run and find said success. So it doesn't really matter what matchup you're in. All that matters is you're playing against the defense that is going to cover and what kind of potential upside you have in the passing game. So let's talk about this. The Arizona Cardinals, Jacksonville Jaguars, Las Vegas Raiders, they led the pack in terms of giving up a lot of points to opposing quarterbacks in the passing game. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have Chicago, Tampa Bay, and Buffalo. Buffalo causing a lot of turnovers. Tampa Bay obviously benefited from the fact that Dak Prescott got injured, and the Chicago Bears benefited from the fact that the weather game completely had, Trey Lance lost out there. Nonetheless, we'll go ahead and refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video, but let's get into the conversation regarding the quarterback position. Let's begin with our number 1. We have Josh Allen taking on the Tennessee Titans. Josh Allen absolutely came out last week on Thursday night and sent a message. I even said that he was exactly going to do that. Send a message to the league that he's ready to go. Now, he takes on the Tennessee Titans, and though many of you may think this is a difficult matchup, the last time he had an opportunity of taking on that defense in 2021, he had a 75% passing completion percentage, 350 passing yards, and 3 passing touchdowns. Of course, he will always have rushing upside. Just look at what he did against the Rams. 10 carries for 56 yards and a rushing touchdown. When he is just getting 11 fantasy points per game alone off rushing statistics, and this guy's got one of the best arms in the league with one of the best receiving cores, ultimately, the upside that is available for Josh Allen claims him the number 1 spot for this week. Moving on, let's talk about Patrick Mahomes, who plays later tonight. This is going to be a shootout, in my opinion. The last couple times these two teams have played, it has been extremely competitive. When you go back to 2021, the games in which Patrick Mahomes has taken on the Los Angeles Chargers, he put up 22.9 and 29.6 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Now, like we saw on Sunday, he does not need Tyreek Hill to succeed. He was able to get himself 360 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns and completely dice up that defense and just win the game in the first half pretty much. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, he's found a lot of success in the past against his division rival. Should continue that tonight on a short week. Moving on to Justin Herbert, the man on the other side of the field that is going to be lining up against the Kansas City Chiefs defense. We have Justin Herbert, who he himself has found a lot of success against this defense. Last year, in the 2 games he played against the Los Angeles Chargers, he was averaging 26.94 fantasy points per game against them. Now, he will not have Keenan Allen, which is certainly going to make a big difference. But when he's been averaging 260 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns against this Kansas City defense, it leads me to believe that regardless of the fact that Keenan's not out there, Mike Williams, DeAndre Carter, Josh Palmer, Austin Eckler, Gerald Everett, those are pieces that are able to get the job done. With Justin Herbert leading the way, it's an automatic play. Moving on, we have Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts could have very easily had himself another rushing touchdown. If it wasn't for the fact that he fell short of a touchdown and in the next play they handed off to a running back, he could have had an extra 6 points on top of his fantasy point total, having himself a 30-point fantasy week easily. Now, he's certainly going to try to run as much as he did last week, but I doubt that it's going to be the case. Even in this last week's performance, the fact that he ran this much and was still able to pass over 200 yards is pretty ridiculous considering he only accomplished that 6 out of the 15 games last season. A lot of that can be contributed to the idea that A.J. Brown, with his 10 catches, had himself 155 receiving yards. That's crazy numbers that pretty much got everything done after the catch. So if we're in a situation where Jalen Hurts is just benefiting purely off the fact that his receiving threats are helping him eclipse those passing yard milestones, all it's going to take is him running the ball consistently. And quite frankly, whether or not he gets a passing touchdown doesn't matter because we know the rushing game is going to be there and it's going to elevate his performance. Moving on, let's talk about Lamar Jackson taking on the Miami Dolphins. He took them on last year. In that contest, he struggled mightily. He only had 15.42 fantasy points against them. They did a lot of blitz packages against Lamar Jackson. They sacked him 4 times early in that game and pretty much kept him relatively uncomfortable for the entirety. Now, they tried to make a late, second half surge, but nothing really came to be. Lamar Jackson ended up losing that game against Miami last year, and I think they're going to similarly come in with a game plan to stop Lamar in that exact same way. With that being said, Lamar is still one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the game. When you have the ability to throw for 3 passing touchdowns and literally only run for 17 yards against the New York Jets and still eclipse over 20 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, that's all we can ask for. He's going to continue to throw the ball, and if in fact the rushing lanes open themselves up, I can expect this man to find some success there. Either way, an automatic start in this week's matchup against Miami. Moving on to Russell Wilson. Now listen, Russell Wilson was, again, kind of relatively slow to start. Like I mentioned last week, in those revenge games where you're going back to your home stadium, it's always going to be a little bit tricky. We saw that with Matthew Stafford last year and Tom Brady. Russell Wilson obviously demonstrated that it's going to be a consistent factor. Anytime one of these quarterbacks get into those highly emotional contests, they're slow to start. But if it wasn't for the fact that they fumbled twice on the 1-yard line, we could have very easily seen Russell Wilson finish with 340 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns against his former team. Now, this upcoming week, he has an incredible 5-star matchup against the Houston Texans. Matt Ryan was able to throw for 350 passing yards and could have had himself 2 to 3 passing touchdowns if his receivers were a little bit better. I'm expecting those kind of numbers for Russell Wilson this week. Moving on to Kyler Murray. Listen, we all know that Kyler Murray has the ability to make plays on the ground, but he's certainly got to be better in the passing game. The fact that he didn't throw for over 200 yards this last week in a game in which they were losing for majority of the contest is concerning. They didn't find success on the ground running the ball with James Conner. So the fact that he wasn't able to eclipse 200 yards is just in the idea that he's not comfortable without DeAndre Hopkins out there. Now, we're hoping that that's not going to be the case as long as they continue to improve. But when he's going to be running away from Max Crosby, running away from Chandler Jones, could be a little bit worrisome. Again, in 2021, there was only one game where he threw for less than 200 passing yards. If we get into a situation where he's consistently not able to get the ball down the field, the guy that last season was the most accurate deep passing quarterback in the league, I'll be greatly surprised. So I'm hoping a bounce back week here against the Raiders. Moving on to Joey Burrow. Listen, Joe Burrow turned over the ball 5 times, minus 10 points. And I understand his fantasy point contribution for you may have not, been as advertised, but it is what it is. We're going to have to continue to roll with the punches and play Joe Burrow because we know he's a stud quarterback. They take on the Dallas Cowboys, and even though Tom Brady didn't find much success, I expect Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, this entire receiving core of studs to find a lot of success this week and a pretty balanced fantasy point output. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention his rushing stats is because in an interview with Pat McAfee last week, he mentioned that he's been working on his running, that he eclipsed over 20 miles per hour during training camp as they've been testing his knee coming off of the ACL a couple of years ago. Last week, he had over 40 rushing yards. If you're going to get a mobility upside from Joe Burrow, imagine the potential when this guy's throwing the ball for over 300 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and still getting those rushing yards. That pretty much elevates him to Justin Herbert levels of production. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Matthew Stafford. Now, speaking of throwing interceptions, Matthew Stafford joined the group last week of Derek Carr and Joe Burrow of just continuously throwing interceptions for no reason whatsoever. Nonetheless, less interceptions will lead to more fantasy points. We know that. If he goes ahead and has more opportunities to score touchdowns, more opportunities to get the ball downfield to Cooper Kupp, Allen Robinson, and Tyler Higbee, more points are going to join him. Now, he takes on the Atlanta Falcons, a defense that absolutely blew a giant lead in the fourth quarter and let Jameis Winston, who wasn't really having a great game in the first 3 quarters of that game, pop off in the fourth and found a lot of success. In my opinion, this Atlanta Falcons matchup is far too juicy to turn away from Matthew Stafford. I am playing him as such. Let's talk about Kirk Cousins, another one of these pretty consistent quarterbacks, a pocket passer to say the least. As of the last 2 seasons, 2020 and 2021, we have seen 12 out of the 16 games in both of those years for Kirk Cousins consist of 2 or more passing touchdowns. If we're going to continue to see that level of a streak continue, then of course he's going to be a viable top 12 quarterback every single week. Last week came off of a game against the Green Bay Packers defense, which again is a very good defense, but considering the contributions of Justin Jefferson, it looked like an easy matchup. 277 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a great overall game. Now they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. They played against the zone all week last week against the Green Bay Packers. That's exactly what the Philadelphia Eagles want to do. They want to sit in the zone and force Kirk Cousins to make difficult decisions. I think he'll be ready for it and have himself a great week as my number 10 quarterback. Let's move on to Trey Lance, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Trey Lance is going to have to improve, but I don't want to go ahead and sit him just off of a singular performance in a terrible weather game. Early on in the game, he was able to pass the ball, but as you got into the second half, it became impossible to throw the ball for both teams. Both Justin Fields and Trey Lance combined for 21 total passing completions in that contest. That is absolutely ridiculous. So with that weather behind us and the future matchup against the Seattle Seahawks ahead of us, I'm expecting Trey Lance to have himself a better game and get back on track, not only as a passer, but as a rushing threat with far more upside. Moving on, let's talk about Derek Carr. Again, he did throw a lot of interceptions, but he takes on the Arizona Cardinals. They're going to watch the division rival and the film that the Kansas City Chiefs put up against that Arizona Cardinals defense, the fact that Patrick Mahomes had 300 plus passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns. And they're going to take, a couple notes out of that book, and they're going to try to implement that themselves this upcoming week in the matchup. I think Derek Carr, what he showed in terms of the opportunity he gave to Davante Adams and Darren Waller, obviously lack thereof for Hunter Renfrow. I expect this team to certainly be throwing the ball 35 times a game, but they're going to get more of a rushing game involved. And when they're able to do so, that play action is going to open up even that much more and be a bigger threat for this offense, helping them out this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 13, we have Tom Brady. You may have been wondering, where is Tom Brady on your list, Andrew? How is he not even in your top 12? Listen, when you play against the New Orleans Saints, this is an extremely difficult matchup purely because of the fact that the New Orleans Saints, I think, have Tom Brady's number. In the last 2 years, there have been 2 games in which Tom Brady has had embarrassingly bad performances. A game of 2.3 fantasy points and a game of 4.7 fantasy points, both in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Now, the other 2 performances he had against his defense, 25.2 and 20.46. Brady has put up 2 great games and 2 abysmal performances. My worry is with Chris Godwin out, Mike Evans on an island with Marshawn Lattimore, and the best receiving options being Julio Jones, who is, again, a veteran, and every time he gets tackled, looks like he got hurt. The fact that Leonard Fournette is already questionable this week with the hamstring that he pulled late in that game, I'm beginning to think this may be a game that we want to go ahead and pivot away from Tom Brady if we have a better option. Otherwise, we're playing him and hoping that we get the upside rather than the potential downside that we've seen him produce against the New Orleans Saints over the last 2 years. Moving on to Aaron Rodgers. Listen, Aaron Rodgers last year against the Chicago Bears averaged 270 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns in both those games. You guys remember it. He scored that touchdown. He said, "I own you," and just flexed on, the crowd at Soldier Field. But if Aaron Rodgers isn't able to put together another great performance where his receiving options are getting the job done, I wouldn't be surprised. Again, without Davante Adams out there and Allen Lazard potentially being injured for another week, we're not even certain that his right and left tackle are going to be ready for this upcoming weekend's contest. If Christian Watson is going to be the number 1 primary receiving option, I have hope that success can be found, but at the levels of 270 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns, that is going to take a full team effort, and everyone has got to step up and help Aaron Rodgers reach that goal. Otherwise, it's going to be tough to do so. Moving on, let's talk about Carson Wentz, a waiver wire option that you can pick up and immediately play this week, playing against the Detroit Lions. And even though the Detroit Lions didn't give up many points in the passing game, it primarily had to do with the fact that Jalen Hurts just ran the ball and the Philadelphia Eagles as a team ran the ball. Now, last week, Carson Wentz had a great performance of 313 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns. He tied his career high with 4 passing touchdowns already in his first game with the Washington Commanders. With the receiving threats that they have surrounding Carson Wentz, again, this may be one of the best receiving corps he's ever had, and it's not even a bold statement. Again, last year, when you look at the Indianapolis Colts with Pittman and T.Y. Hilton, really, and Zach Pascal, is that really the best receiving corps he's had? You go back to the days with Philadelphia. He had a year in which he had Alshon Jeffrey, he had Nelson Aguilar. Are those the best options he's ever had? I think with Terry McLaurin right now, Curtis Samuel, if they're both at their prime and playing extremely well, it could absolutely elevate the play of Carson Wentz this year. But in specific this week, should be great considering the matchup. Let's move on to the final quarterback I wanted to mention. We have Jameis famous Winston. Listen, Jameis takes on his former team. Last year, he had an opportunity of playing this team in the first quarter prior to his ACL being torn, and Trevor Siemian had to come into the game. But he looked good prior to that injury. Again, he's kind of working off the dust rather than the rust, I would say. And though he didn't look good for the first 3 quarters of that game against the Atlanta Falcons, where he had less than 100 passing yards, I think we're going to get into more of that fourth quarter Jameis Winston, where there's more urgency to throw the ball down the field, make big plays with Jarvis Landry, Michael Thomas, Chris Olave. Obviously, we need to see more utilization out of Alvin Kamara, out of this backfield, but ultimately, if this offense continues to find their groove and click against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they should be able to find success and be another one of these streaming options. We have Jameis Winston as our number 16. All right, we're going to go ahead, throw up the final graphic for today, having our top 12 quarterbacks on screen for week 2 of the 2022 fantasy football season. And that's pretty much going to cover it. Again, do not forget to subscribe down below. Click the like button. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys think. Are there any tight end or quarterbacks, kind of sleeper options that may be viable plays? Man, I'm looking at Trey Lance's hairline. What the heck is happening there? Anyway, that pretty much covers it for us. We'll talk about Trey Lance's hairline at a different time. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Use the link down in the description. For those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, if you didn't join enough leagues this season, Underdog Fantasy is the way to keep games exciting, especially if you don't have fantasy participants in that contest, specifically like tonight. If you don't have any Chiefs, you don't have any Chargers that you're cheering for, you can go ahead, play their pick'ems game, pick higher or lower on a given statistic. Go ahead and draft a team of flex players from tonight's game. Have some fun with it. Use promo code Andrew when you sign up making a first-time deposit. While clicking the link down in the description, you'll get a first-time deposit match up to $100. Check that out. And until tomorrow, we'll talk about some must-start players and talk more about some pick'ems plays. I'll see you guys. Peace.